To weigh out the 0.1 grams of acetyl salicylic acid, you need to put in the weigh boat into the weighing balance and press the tare or 0 button on the bottom right hand side. Then add the powder to the weigh boat until it registers 100 milligrams or 0.1 grams. First of all, you need to pour out 50 ml of the citrate buffer that you made last week. In this case, we have one labelled pH 2.4, but whatever pH solution you used, you can use that. 50 ml is poured out into a yellow top container. To this, you're going to add the 0.1 grams or 100 milligrams of the acetyl salicylic acid you've just made up, and you can use a dropper or some kind of a transfer pipette to wash out the weigh boat in order to get all of the powder dissolved into the solution. You can then add the magnetic stirrer and place it on to the magnetic stirring machine and turn it up to 3 or 4 in order to make sure it's stirring. After the acetyl salicylic acid has been dissolved, you can then stop the stir and pour it into a new freshly labelled volumetric flask. After this has been added, you can now wash out the yellow top container several times with the buffer in order to make sure any of the powder gets fully transferred across. This can then be made up fully to the mark. As you approach the meniscus, you can then start to add the buffer dropwise in order to make sure that the meniscus is reached. So after the solution has been made up in the volumetric flask, you need to invert it a few times, after which then you can pour a small amount of it into a yellow cap tube. From this now you are going to pipette 4 ml of the solution into a new pipette called tube A. So using a P5000, you pipette 4 ml into tube A and 5 ml into tube B. After this has been done, you now must transfer 5 ml of an isopropanol and hexane mixture, labelled here, into the tube labelled B. This should cause a separation of phases. In order to allow for this to happen, you need to invert it a number of times over 5 minutes in order to make sure it's fully mixed. After this, you can let it settle in the rack for a minute or two. After allowing the tube to settle, there should be a distinct separation of layers. You then must take 2 mils off the top layer and dispose it in the waste. Following which you take 4 mils from the bottom layer. This 4 mils will now be transferred into a new tube labelled B. After the 4 mils have been added, you can then add 1 mil using a P1000 of the ferric nitrate solution into the tube B. The contents are then shaken and allowed the colour to develop by returning it to the rack for a couple of minutes. The final step is to pipette 200 microliters of both A and B for each of your standard solutions of different pHs into a 96 well plate in order to measure the absorbance. This is carried out for each of your solutions of different pH and repeated for solution B. The plate should be labelled carefully in your lab book so you know which pH solutions were in which row. The absorbance then is measured at 540 nanometers on the spectrophotometer. Absorbance of A tubes should be called absorbance 1 and absorbance of B tubes should be called absorbance 2. Follow the calculations in your lab manual in order to be able to carry out your graph and calculations.